remained somewhat neutral during the Revolutionary War, which was not easy for Native Americans. They were kind of pulled in both directions, as you can imagine. Right after the war, the Creek Nation was invited to grant Georgia the Oconee River, which they summarily denied. And during the summer session of the Georgia legislature, the governor, Lyman Hall, warned the Georgia legislature not to push the issue, otherwise it would provoke a conflict with the state. Unwisely, they did press the issue, and what Georgia history claims to be the Treaty of 1783 is what Georgia based its westward expansion to the Oconee River. This is what Talasy had to say at that meeting. He was the only Miko to attend the Augusta meeting in 1783. He was there on a trade mission to try to reestablish trade with the state. And as he told the Georgians there, that the lands belonged to the whole body of the nation. It was public property. It was public property of the Creek Nation. Nonetheless, he did offer to go back to the Creek Nation and lobby for a compromise. And the compromise would be the eastern margin of the Oconee River Valley. And that's the, I have a pointer. That's this dark area right here. That's the dark area right here. That's the Oconee River Valley. But keep in mind, that's the eastern portion of the Oconee River Valley. He was proposing everything east of the North Oconee. A treaty came out of that, which never made it back to the Creek Nation. So they found out about it late. And they found out about it only because some of the hunters in the valley during the winter of 83 and 84 found surveyors crisscrossing the Oconee River. Naturally, they were pretty upset about that. Georgia, out of that treaty, inserted a phrase that the Surveyor General of the state, a man named Richard Call, interpreted to mean the entire drainage of the Oconee River Valley. And those words were, "and all the waters of the same." So rather than Talasy Miko's compromise, the surveyors really spread out through the entire basin. And some of them actually reached some of the headwaters of the Ogeechee River in 1784. This is a survey plat. This is evidence of this. This is a survey plat signed by Richard Call, who was the Surveyor General of the state, 1786. But you will notice, well, you probably can't see this, but it says South Fork of Oconee River. So it's a South Fork, but look, he surveys beyond the South Fork of the Oconee River. So it does indicate that when the surveyors went out there, they took a very literal view of this, all the waters of the same, inserted in the treaty. The Creek Nation, when they did find out about the treaty, they sent a message to Georgia leaders to order their surveyors out of the valley. Meanwhile, at the the land office in Augusta, this was the state of affairs. I degrade the most unruly tempest by comparison with the savage disposition and brutal temper of lawless and ungovernable men, subject to no control and averse to everything that opposes their will. That was the judgment of the land office clerk in Augusta in 1784, when a lot of these young fighters from the Revolutionary War showed up with their land certificates saying, "We want our land." On the other side of the equation, this was the sentiment in the Creek Nation. The land you want is ours. It's belonged to our fathers since the first rising of the sun. We cannot spare them, and you have already more than you can take care of. I think that's a very interesting analysis. That there are other examples of this. Native Americans were very observant as to how the land was used, and they were kind of surprised at how little it was used, although so much land had already been granted to the state. So you already have more than you can take care of. We speak the language of every man in our nation when we say we will spill the last drop of our blood rather than yield up to you the lands on the Oconee River. But remember that statement, you already have more that you could take care of. Valuable survey plat from William Few, one of the fathers of the state. And this was the analysis of one of the Creek leaders. Parties of Georgians, when employed in marking out their surveys, uniformly attacked any of our people who chanced to fall in their way, although peaceably hunting game on their own ground. Now, this document may have more significance than first appears. You notice that the artist did a sketch of an Indian in profile here, and I want to focus in on that and draw your attention to an insert in the Georgia depredations file, which is a file of damages and losses that settlers suffered during the Oconee War. There's one little passage in the large file that survives from that, and it may have something to do with that equation. 10 Indians killed by the above county men. It's interesting that there's Indian head and then there's a multiplication of 10, seems to indicate. We won't know for sure, but it's a very interesting document to survive from those years. That is a branch of the Oconee River. Some people think it's Sandy Creek. Onward. These last strides tell us they never mean to let their foot rest. Our lands are our life and breath. If we part with them, we part with our blood. Yeholamiko, Speaker of the Creek Council. And so that spring, they came to this conclusion. We'll avail ourselves the use of arms to drive the Georgians off our lands. Once they are evicted and put within their limits, there we shall stop. So eviction was the goal. It wasn't a savage war. It was a war of eviction, and they were clearing settlements. Most of the damage suffered was fire. Fire was a principal method of eviction, and very few settlers contested the creeks when they showed up. Early on, they actually sent warnings to the settlers to move out because they realized that the Georgia leaders were not going to do that. Here's a newspaper insert in Charleston, May '86. And it's interesting, letters received from the frontiers of Georgia advising that the Indians had killed 2 surveyors. Survey, the word survey was translated in the Creek language, the Muskogee language, Ikanopaya, which means something like land charmers. So there's an element of sorcery that Native Americans seem to view surveyors with. And it's interesting, isn't it, that, here's Talasimiko at the beginning of this presentation saying the land belonged to all of the nation. Well, these surveys were transforming the way people looked at the land. It was going from the public domain, in that case, the Creek public domain, into the private Georgia domain. So it was a very radical change in not only how people viewed the land, but how they used the land. Posted signs started showing up. Through the course of these years, these were the principal years of the warfare, the conflict occurred throughout the basin, and even down toward the St. Mary's River. So the conflict occurred throughout the Oconee Valley, and this is why the federal government had to get involved. The Creek Nation very smartly formed a military and trade alliance with the Spanish Crown, who ran colonies in Florida at this time. So as you'll see, the consequence of this war to Georgia was pretty devastating. We find our defensive measures of little effect. This is one of the primary reasons that Georgians adopted the Constitution unanimously and on their first session of the legislature, because they were involved in a war with the Creek Nation over the Oconee Valley. And we have people that attended those meetings that explicitly spell that out in the documents surviving from that period. So an interesting aspect of Georgia's history that you are tough to find in textbooks. Anyways, here's George Hanley's observation. And very shortly, George Washington sent his men to intervene and find a compromise solution. It wasn't the solution that Georgians were hoping for, however. These are maps from that period. These are military maps. They were commissioned by the Adjutant General for the state in 1793, and it locates all the major forts, and these were the garrison forts, and so very valuable to have in the collection. And here's a new map translating state and federal forts to the Oconee River Valley. Just the significance of the war shows up in some interesting places. Here's Captain Brand, Mohawk chief of the Six Nations, 1793, at the rapids of the Miami. Messengers from the Creek Nations arrived there and brought authentic information. The white people have encroached upon that part of the Confederacy. This intelligence gave a change to our proceedings and probably was the sole cause in the termination of negotiations for peace. This is just a reminder to you all that Native American relations in this time were very complex and very vast over the whole continent. Great Lakes down to. Here's an observation that one of the Oconee settlers made. She lays the death of her husband to Captain Harrison. She said so repeatedly, and that it has given offense to the captain. The doctrine in her neighborhood was, let us kill the Indians, bring on a war, we should get more land. Her husband replied no, he would oppose anything of that sort. He would never be guilty of murder for property. So, divided views of the war. James Jackson, the people of the state are thick settled. They must go somewhere. They cannot return back from whence their fathers came, as there is no land to be had. If they return, their families must starve. An interesting observation. Why? Something happened to the land that they'd settled. And here's the creek view. If we part with any more of our land, we'll bring ruin to our children. We're increasing in number as well as the white people. And sure enough, during this time, Native American populations in the South were on the rebound. And before long, every part of our country will be valuable to our people. If we can hold our lands, there'll always be a turkey or deer. It speaks for itself, doesn't it? And here's the Oconee River border as established in 1796 by federal treaties. And I'm going to bring you to the last map to show you a regional configuration. This was the Creek attitude on losing that part of the Oconee, pulling out their hearts and throwing them away. So that gives you an idea of the Southeast in 1800. Thanks a lot.